The security footage showed HOA President Delilah Thornfield standing waist-deep in my ranch pond at 3:47 a.m., frantically trying to retrieve something from the murky water, while my terrified horses bolted in every direction. What she didn't know was that every word she'd spoken during her midnight operation was being broadcast live to the entire Willowbrook Estates community through the emergency PA system. By dawn, her confession about the ultrasonic devices she'd planted to torture my animals had gone viral, and federal agents were already en route to our luxury subdivision. I'm Cassian Riverstone, and this is the story of how our HOA's war against my family's century-old horse ranch exposed a conspiracy that reached from our gated community all the way to Washington, D.C. What started as petty complaints about my horses drinking from our ancestral pond ended with a federal investigation, national media attention, and the most satisfying arrest I've ever witnessed. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday morning in late August, when I found the first violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox. Willowbrook Estates HOA had been incorporated around my family's property in 2018, turning our rural horse ranch into the centerpiece of an upscale development. The developers had promised that our operation would be grandfathered in, that our horses would be a charming amenity for the new residents. They'd lied. The violation notice was printed on ivory letterhead, with gold embossing, the kind of pretentious stationery that screamed money and authority, immediate compliance required. It announced in bold red letters, unauthorized livestock, creating health hazards and property value depreciation. I read it twice, then called my neighbor Jake Morrison, whose family had worked alongside mine for 3 generations. Jake's property sat directly across from the development's main entrance. His modest farmhouse, a stark contrast to the million-dollar McMansions that now surrounded us. They hit me too, Jake said when he arrived 20 minutes later, waving an identical notice. Apparently my chickens are now agricultural nuisances, incompatible with residential zoning. We compared violations while standing next to the spring-fed pond that had watered our livestock since 1892. The water ran crystal clear, fed by mountain springs that had never run dry. Even during the worst droughts, my 12 horses grazed peacefully around its edges, their presence as natural and timeless as the Colorado mountains that surrounded our valley. This is impossible, I said, studying the legal jargon. Our property was here first. Water rights predate their development by over a century. That's when Jake pointed toward the development's clubhouse, a sprawling Mediterranean monstrosity that housed the HOA's offices, fitness center, and community pool. Standing on its second-floor balcony with binoculars trained on my horses was a woman I recognized from the neighborhood welcome wagon. Delilah Thornfield looked like Central Casting's idea of an HOA president, perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer athletic wear that had never seen actual exercise, and the kind of practiced smile that politicians use when they're lying to your face. She'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months earlier, immediately volunteering for every committee before somehow maneuvering herself into the presidency within 90 days. She's been watching your place for weeks, Jake observed, always with those binoculars, always taking notes. I grabbed my own binoculars and focused on Delilah's balcony. She wasn't just observing my horses, she was documenting their every movement with a professional-grade camera equipped with a telephoto lens. Her notes were detailed enough to be visible from 300 yards away, filled with timestamps and behavioral observations that looked more like surveillance reports than neighborhood complaints. The next morning brought escalation. I woke to find bright orange parking boots clamped onto both my truck and horse trailer. Despite the fact that both vehicles were parked well within my property lines, the boots were secured with industrial-grade locks and bore official-looking HOA warnings about unauthorized commercial vehicle storage. The absurdity was breathtaking. My truck was a standard Ford F-250 that half the neighborhood drove. The horse trailer was stored behind my barn, completely out of sight from any public areas. But the boots came with $500 removal fees and threats of property liens if not paid within 72 hours. I called the locksmith, then headed to the HOA office to demand an explanation. Willowbrook Estates' clubhouse reeked of new money and old prejudices. Crystal chandeliers hung over Italian marble floors, while oil paintings of fox hunts decorated walls that had never seen anything more rustic than a suburban riding mower. The HOA offices occupied the building's entire second floor, accessible only through a secured entrance that required keycard access. Delilah kept me waiting in the lobby for 45 minutes. A power play designed to establish dominance. When she finally appeared, she was flanked by two men in expensive suits, who introduced themselves as the HOA's legal counsel and community enforcement specialist, Mr. Riverstone. Delilah began, her voice carrying the condescending tone that suburban royalty reserves for peasants who dare question their authority. "I trust you received our compliance notices?" "I received harassment disguised as legal documents," I replied. "My property predates your development by over a century. You have no authority over my operations." The lawyer, a thin man named Bradford Kensington, who probably charged $500 an hour to intimidate working-class families, stepped forward with a leather portfolio that looked thick enough to choke a horse. "Mr. Riverstone, while your property may have historical precedence, it now exists within the legally established boundaries of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Your grandfather signed easement agreements in 2017 that subject portions of your land to HOA governance. He produced documents that made my blood run cold. Grandfather's signature appeared on agreements I'd never seen. Contracts that granted the HOA authority over shared water resources and community aesthetic standards. The paperwork looked legitimate, complete with notary seals and witness signatures. "This is impossible," I said, examining the documents. "My grandfather died in 2016. He couldn't have signed anything in 2017. Delilah's smile could have frozen July sunshine. "Perhaps you should consult with an attorney. Mr. Riverstone, I'm sure they can explain the legal complexities of property succession and estate obligations." The threat was clear: fight us and face bankruptcy through legal fees. Submit to our authority, or lose everything your family had built over 5 generations. That afternoon, I called Patricia Wyndham, the civil rights attorney who'd helped our community fight the original development's environmental impact challenges. Patricia was a 70-year-old legal warrior who'd spent 4 decades defending working families against corporate bullies. "Cassian, those signatures are forgeries," she said after examining the documents for 10 minutes. "I helped your grandfather update his will in 2015. He would never have signed away water rights, and he certainly couldn't have done it posthumously. So what's our next move? We document everything. Start recording every interaction with the HOA. Install security cameras if you don't have them already. And whatever you do, don't let them provoke you into doing something stupid. They're looking for any excuse to paint you as the unreasonable one." Patricia's advice proved prophetic. The HOA's harassment campaign escalated with military precision. Code enforcement officers appeared daily, measuring my grass with rulers to issue citations for excessive height violations when blades exceeded their 3-inch maximum. My horses were reported to animal control for displaying aggressive behavior after a stallion snorted at a jogger who'd wandered onto private property. Even my American flag was cited for improper display standards because it flew higher than the HOA's decorative banners. But Delilah's masterpiece of petty tyranny came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in early September. I returned from a supply run to find my horses gathered around the pond in obvious distress. They were pacing, ears pinned back, refusing to drink despite the 90-degree heat. That's when I noticed the equipment. Submerged just beneath the pond's surface were 3 metallic devices about the size of dinner plates. They hummed with barely audible electronic sounds and emitted flashing lights that seemed designed to create anxiety in livestock. My horses, who'd been drinking from this pond their entire lives, were now terrified to approach the water that was essential to their survival. I waded into the pond and grabbed the nearest device. It was warm to the touch and bore a manufacturer's label: Ultrasonic Animal Deterrent System, industrial grade. The specifications indicated it could broadcast high-frequency sounds specifically calibrated to cause distress in horses, cattle, and other large mammals. My phone was already recording when I called the HOA office. "Delilah, this is Cassian Riverstone. I'm standing in my pond looking at electronic devices that are torturing my horses. You have 60 seconds to explain what these things are doing on my property before I call the police." Her response was everything I'd hoped for and more. "Mr. Riverstone, those are approved environmental protection devices designed to prevent livestock contamination of shared water resources. The HOA board voted unanimously to install them after receiving complaints about animal waste affecting community water quality. These devices are on my private property, torturing my animals, and installed without my permission. That's criminal trespass and animal abuse. I'm afraid you're mistaken about the property lines. Mr. Riverstone, our recent survey shows that pond extends into HOA common areas. We have every right to protect community resources from agricultural contamination. I ended the call and immediately dialed Patricia Wyndham. Patricia, they've planted torture devices in my pond. The horses can't drink. And Delilah just admitted the HOA installed them. Don't touch anything else. I'm calling the Sheriff's Department and the State Attorney General's office. This crosses the line from harassment into criminal activity. While waiting for law enforcement, I decided to conduct my own investigation. The 3 devices were connected by underwater cables that led toward the development side of the pond. Following the cables required diving beneath lily pads and cattails, but the trail was clear enough to trace to a control box hidden among the landscaping behind the clubhouse. The control box was a sophisticated piece of equipment with digital displays showing frequency settings, timer controls, and battery levels. Most importantly, it had a manufacturer's plate that included serial numbers and a customer service contact. But what made my heart race was the small video camera mounted above the control panel, positioned to record my horses suffer. They weren't just torturing my animals. They were documenting it. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stop interfering with community environmental protection or face escalated enforcement measures. I screenshotted the threat. Then noticed something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. The control box had a wireless signal indicator showing active connection to the clubhouse's Wi-Fi network. More importantly, it had an external antenna that looked suspiciously like the kind used for broadcasting rather than receiving signals. 20 minutes of technical investigation revealed that the device wasn't just torturing my horses, it was streaming live video to a private YouTube channel called Willowbrook Wildlife Management. The channel had been broadcasting my animals' distress for 3 weeks, complete with timestamps and narrated commentary about aggressive livestock behavior. But Delilah had made one crucial mistake. The channel's metadata showed it was registered to her personal email address and linked to her social media accounts. She'd been live streaming my horses' suffering as entertainment for her followers. I called Patricia back with the new information. Cassian, this is federal territory now. Animal abuse, harassment, fraud, and potentially civil rights violations. I'm activating some contacts at the Justice Department. How long before we can get help? I've got a friend at the FBI's white-collar crime division. Give me 2 hours. Those 2 hours felt like 2 years. I sat on my porch watching my horses pace around the pond they couldn't approach, their distress obvious to anyone with basic animal knowledge. Delilah's torture devices were forcing them to choose between dehydration and psychological trauma. That's when inspiration struck. The devices were broadcasting on the same Wi-Fi network as the clubhouse's community announcement system, a network that I'd helped install 3 years earlier when the developers needed technical assistance with their infrastructure, a network whose administrative passwords I still remembered. It took exactly 12 minutes to hack into the PA system. At 6:30 p.m., as Willowbrook Estates residents gathered around their community pool for the weekly social hour, my voice echoed through every speaker in the development. Good evening, neighbors. This is Cassian Riverstone, and I want to share something important about your HOA president. I played the recorded phone call where Delilah admitted installing the torture devices. I read excerpts from her live stream comments about breaking the spirit of stubborn animals. I shared screenshots of her social media posts, celebrating my horse's distress. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Residents began shouting questions at Delilah, who was standing by the pool in a white sundress, looking like a defendant who'd just been caught lying under oath. Furthermore, I continued through the PA system. I want everyone to know that sheriff's deputies are en route to investigate criminal animal abuse. I encourage any residents who have witnessed this harassment to document everything they've seen. That's when Delilah made the mistake that would define the rest of this story. Instead of denying the charges or claiming ignorance, she grabbed the microphone from the pool's DJ booth and began defending her actions over the same PA system I was using. That man's horses are a threat to our community. They contaminate our water and lower our property values. Everything I've done is for the protection and benefit of Willowbrook Estates. Her voice carried across the entire development, reaching not just the pool area but every home, every patio, every corner where residents might be enjoying their evening. She was confessing to animal abuse and harassment over a public address system that was broadcasting to 300 families. I recorded every word. Those animals don't belong in a civilized community. If legal methods won't remove them, then other measures are justified. The crowd around the pool had gone silent. Parents were covering their children's ears. Elderly residents were shaking their heads in disgust. Even Delilah's closest allies on the HOA board were backing away from her like she had something contagious. That's when I heard the sirens. 3 sheriff's department cruisers came through the development's main gate with lights flashing and sirens wailing. Behind them followed 2 animal control vehicles and a black SUV that could only belong to federal agents. But the real surprise came when a news van from Channel 7 pulled through the gate behind the official vehicles. Someone had called the media, and Delilah's public confession was about to become primetime television. I walked down to meet the law enforcement convoy, my phone still recording as Delilah's voice continued ranting through the PA system about property values and community standards. The lead sheriff's deputy, a no-nonsense woman named Captain Rodriguez, stepped out of her cruiser with a look that suggested she'd already heard enough. "Mr. Riverstone, I'm Captain Rodriguez. We received reports of animal abuse and harassment. Captain, the devices are still in my pond. The control system is behind the clubhouse. And everything you need to hear is coming through those speakers right now." Delilah's voice carried across the property like the soundtrack to her own destruction. "I don't care about his legal rights. Those horses are incompatible with our lifestyle standards." Captain Rodriguez raised her eyebrows. "Is she always this helpful with confessions? This is actually restrained for her." The federal agent emerged from the black SUV. A sharp-eyed man in his 40s, who introduced himself as Agent Mitchell from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He'd been monitoring the situation since Patricia's call and had arrived just in time to witness Delilah's public breakdown. "Mr. Riverstone, we're going to need to document everything. The devices, the control system, the video streams, and any communications you've received." As we walked toward the pond, Delilah's voice grew more desperate and more incriminating. "Someone has to take action against these agricultural nuisances. If the legal system won't protect property values, then concerned citizens must." The news crew was setting up their equipment, the reporter clearly delighted to have stumbled into a story that was unfolding in real time. Delilah's voice provided perfect background audio as the camera captured federal agents documenting evidence of animal abuse. We reached the pond just as my horses finally gathered enough courage to approach the water. The devices were still humming their electronic torture song, clearly audible now that someone was listening for them. Agent Mitchell waded into the pond and carefully extracted the first device, Industrial Grade Ultrasonic Deterrent. These things cost about $800 each. Someone invested serious money in harassing your animals. Captain Rodriguez was documenting everything with her phone while her deputies secured the control box. "Mr. Riverstone, how long has this been going on?" "The devices have been here about 3 weeks. The general harassment started in August." That's when we heard splashing from the far end of the pond. Delilah Thornfield was wading into the water wearing her white sundress and a look of absolute panic. She was frantically reaching for something beneath the surface, something that apparently couldn't wait for law enforcement to discover. "Ma'am, step out of the water immediately," Captain Rodriguez shouted. But Delilah was on a mission. She dove beneath the surface, her expensive dress billowing around her as she searched for whatever she'd hidden in my pond. When she emerged 30 seconds later, she was clutching a waterproof container about the size of a shoebox. Agent Mitchell was already moving toward her. "Ma'am, you're interfering with a federal investigation. Come out of the water now." Delilah looked around wildly, realizing that every eye in the development was focused on her. The PA system was still broadcasting, which meant her every word was being transmitted to 300 families and recorded by news cameras. That's when she made the confession that would end her HOA presidency and begin her criminal prosecution. "You don't understand," she screamed, holding the waterproof container above her head like some kind of trophy. "This evidence proves everything. The horses, the property values, the contamination, it's all documented." Agent Mitchell reached her and calmly took possession of the container. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." But Delilah was beyond rational thought, standing waist deep in my pond, dripping wet in front of news cameras and federal agents. She continued her confession with the determination of someone who'd finally snapped under pressure. I have recordings of every horse behavior, water quality measurements, property damage assessments, everything needed to prove that agricultural operations are incompatible with residential communities. The crowd that had gathered around the pond was recording everything with their phones. Delilah's breakdown was being live-streamed to social media by dozens of residents who'd initially supported her anti-horse campaign. Captain Rodriguez waded into the pond and placed Delilah under arrest while the news cameras captured every moment. Delilah Thornfield, you're under arrest for animal abuse, criminal trespass, harassment, and interfering with a federal investigation. As they led her toward the patrol car, Delilah turned back toward me with a look of pure desperation. This isn't over. Riverstone, there are bigger forces at work here than you realize. People with real power who won't let you destroy their investments. Agent Mitchell stepped between us. Ma'am, anything else you say can and will be used against you in court? But Delilah's final warning sent chills down my spine. As the patrol car drove away with our disgraced HOA president in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that her confession about bigger forces was more than just the ranting of a defeated woman. The waterproof container Agent Mitchell had seized would prove to contain documents that exposed a conspiracy reaching far beyond our quiet subdivision. But that revelation was still hours away. And as I watched the news van follow the patrol car toward the main gate, I had no idea that Delilah's arrest was just the beginning of the most dangerous week of my life. The horses were finally drinking from their pond again, and justice seemed served. But the war for Willowbrook Estates was just getting started. The contents of Delilah's waterproof container turned my blood to ice water. Agent Mitchell spread the documents across my kitchen table at 11:30 p.m., 3 hours after Delilah's arrest. And what we discovered transformed a simple HOA harassment case into a federal investigation that would make national headlines. The first document was a contract bearing my grandfather's forged signature, but this wasn't the HOA easement agreement I'd seen earlier. This was a land purchase option granting something called Meridian Development Consortium the right to buy my entire ranch for $2.5 million, with automatic execution upon my death or voluntary relocation. Your grandfather supposedly signed this 3 months after he died. Agent Mitchell observed, studying the notary seal, someone's been planning this takeover for years. The second document was worse. It was a geological survey showing massive natural gas deposits beneath my property, worth an estimated $50 million in extraction rights. The survey was dated 6 months before Delilah moved to Willowbrook Estates, proving that the HOA harassment campaign was cover for an energy theft operation. But the third document made me understand why Delilah had been so desperate to retrieve this evidence. It was a kill order. Jesus Christ, Patricia Wyndham whispered, reading over my shoulder. She'd arrived within minutes of Agent Mitchell's call, bringing coffee and the grim expression of someone who'd seen too many corporate crimes. Cassian, this is a contract on your life. The document was disguised as an asset protection insurance policy, but the language was clear to anyone familiar with corporate assassination. Upon my accidental death, ownership of the ranch would transfer to Meridian Development Consortium through a maze of shell companies and offshore trusts. The policy was worth $10 million and had been active for 8 months. They've been planning to murder me since last December, I said, the reality sinking in like quicksand. The HOA harassment was meant to drive me away voluntarily. When that failed, they moved to Plan B. Agent Mitchell was already on his phone with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. We need protective custody and a full investigation team. This is racketeering with interstate implications. But before federal protection could arrive, the real power behind Meridian Development announced their presence with a display of force that shook the entire valley. At 12:45 a.m., 17 black SUVs rolled through Willowbrook Estates' main gate like an occupying army. They carried no license plates, and their windows were tinted dark enough to hide military equipment. The vehicles positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the development, blocking every exit and establishing a perimeter that trapped 300 families in their own neighborhood. My security cameras captured everything as armed men in tactical gear emerged from the SUVs. They weren't police or federal agents. They moved with the precision of private military contractors who'd learned their trade in foreign oil fields. Agent Mitchell's radio crackled with emergency traffic. All units, We have armed hostiles surrounding Willowbrook Estates. Request immediate backup and helicopter support." That's when my phone rang. The voice that answered was cultured, educated, and absolutely terrifying in its calm professionalism. "Mr. Riverstone, my name is Victoria Blackstone. I represent certain business interests that have invested considerable resources in acquiring your property. I'm calling to offer you one final opportunity to accept our generous relocation package. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but federal agents are on my property investigating your murder contract. This conversation is being recorded." Her laugh was like ice breaking in a whiskey glass. "Mr. Riverstone, those federal agents are about to discover that local authority means very little when serious money is involved. I have 17 armed contractors surrounding your neighborhood, and they're prepared to resolve this situation permanently if necessary." Through my window, I could see the tactical teams moving house to house, forcing residents to remain indoors while they established control of the development. Children were crying in the distance, and sirens wailed from multiple directions as local law enforcement tried to respond to what was essentially a military occupation of a civilian neighborhood. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Sign the property transfer documents. Take our $20 million relocation payment, disappear quietly. Your horses will be relocated to a preserve in Montana, and everyone lives happily ever after. And if I refuse, then you'll suffer an unfortunate accident, just like your grandfather did." The line went dead, but her final words hit me like a physical blow. Grandfather hadn't died in a farming accident. He'd been murdered for refusing to sell the ranch. Agent Mitchell was coordinating with tactical support when my security system alerted me to movement around the horse pasture. 4 men in camouflage were approaching my animals with what looked like tranquilizer guns. "They're going after the horses," I said, grabbing my shotgun from the rack above the fireplace. "Cassian, stay inside. We have tactical teams en route," but I couldn't watch them drug my horses. These animals had been traumatized enough by Delilah's torture devices. I wasn't going to let mercenaries finish what the HOA had started. I slipped out through the basement exit, using drainage ditches and tree cover to approach the pasture without being detected. The tactical teams were focused on the house and hadn't established a perimeter around the livestock areas. My 12 horses were huddled together near the pond, clearly agitated by the armed strangers invading their territory. The lead stallion, Thunder, was positioned protectively in front of the mares, his ears pinned back and muscles tensed for flight or fight. The mercenaries were 50 yards away and closing fast. I had maybe 2 minutes before they reached the horses. That's when I remembered the PA system I'd used to expose Delilah's confession. The clubhouse was only 300 yards away, and I still had administrative access to their Wi-Fi network. I pulled out my phone and activated the community broadcast system, but instead of speaking myself, I opened a 3-way call with Agent Mitchell and Patricia Wyndham. "This is FBI Agent Mitchell, broadcasting to all residents of Willowbrook Estates. You are witnessing an illegal occupation by armed mercenaries employed by Meridian Development Consortium. Document everything you see and upload it to social media immediately. The world needs to witness what corporate terrorism looks like." Patricia's voice joined the broadcast. "Residents. This is attorney Patricia Wyndham. You are protected by federal law. These mercenaries have no legal authority. Record their faces, their license plates, their weapons. This evidence will be crucial for prosecution." The effect was immediate and electric. Lights began turning on in houses throughout the development. Windows opened as residents aimed their phones at the tactical teams. Within minutes, live streams were broadcasting to Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok as 300 families documented the corporate invasion of their neighborhood. The mercenaries' communication systems crackled with confusion as their covert operation became a viral social media event. They'd been trained for overseas operations where witnesses could be silenced or ignored. They weren't prepared for American suburbs where everyone had cameras and internet access. But the men approaching my horses didn't retreat. If anything, they moved faster. Realizing their window for completing the mission was closing rapidly, I reached the fence line just as the lead mercenary raised his tranquilizer gun toward Thunder. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, a magnificent display of defiance that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so dangerous. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping into the open with my shotgun visible. "Get away from my horses!" 4 weapon muzzles swung toward me with military precision. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and probably about to die, defending livestock that most people would consider replaceable. That's when Thunder made his choice. The stallion charged the nearest mercenary with 1,400 pounds of fury and protective instinct. The man dove sideways, his tranquilizer gun flying into the pond, as Thunder's hooves barely missed his head. The other horses followed their leader's example, scattering in different directions to make themselves harder targets. What had been a simple capture operation became chaos, as my animals used intelligence and teamwork to outmaneuver trained soldiers. I took advantage of the confusion to retreat toward the tree line. But one of the mercenaries was faster. He tackled me from behind, driving me face first into the muddy ground beside the pond. "You should have taken the money," he said, pressing a gun barrel against the back of my skull. That's when the cavalry arrived. Helicopter rotors thundered overhead as federal tactical teams fast-roped into the pasture. The FBI's hostage rescue unit had responded to Agent Mitchell's emergency call with overwhelming force, and suddenly my would-be assassin was surrounded by agents who'd trained for exactly this type of corporate terrorism. "Drop your weapon, FBI." The mercenary released me and raised his hands. Smart enough to recognize when he was beaten, his teammates were surrendering throughout the development as federal agents established control of the situation. But the real surprise came when Victoria Blackstone herself stepped out of the lead helicopter, flanked by 2 federal marshals and wearing handcuffs that caught the morning sunlight like jewelry. Miss Blackstone was arrested at Denver International Airport attempting to flee to a non-extradition country. Agent Mitchell explained as paramedics checked me for injuries. "Apparently your livestream broadcast spooked her investors." The next 6 hours brought revelations that made national news. Meridian Development Consortium was a front for Russian oligarchs who'd been systematically acquiring American energy resources through murder, fraud, and corporate intimidation. My ranch was just one target in a network that spanned 12 states and involved dozens of suspicious deaths. Delilah Thornfield wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was a desperate woman whose own family had been destroyed by the same organization she'd agreed to help. Her parents' farm in Nebraska had been stolen through identical methods, and Meridian had recruited her by threatening her elderly mother's life. "They promised me that if I drove you away voluntarily, no one would get hurt," Delilah confessed during her plea bargain interview. "I thought I was saving you from what happened to my family." The irony was devastating. She'd been torturing my horses to protect me from assassination, believing that making me miserable was more humane than letting me die for refusing to sell. By noon, the story had exploded across social media and cable news. "Corporate Army occupies Colorado suburb" became the top trending topic on Twitter. Video footage of my horses defending themselves against armed mercenaries went viral on TikTok. News anchors struggled to explain how foreign corporations had been murdering American farmers while local HOAs provided cover for their operations. The residents of Willowbrook Estates became overnight heroes, their phone footage providing crucial evidence for federal prosecutors. Mrs. Chen from Maple Street had captured perfect video of mercenaries threatening children. The Martinez family had live-streamed tactical teams cutting phone lines. Even the teenage skateboarders, who usually annoyed everyone, had documented license plates and weapon serial numbers. This community came together when it mattered most. Patricia told reporters during the afternoon press conference, "They proved that ordinary Americans won't tolerate foreign interference in our neighborhoods." The legal aftermath was swift and satisfying. Victoria Blackstone received life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Her mercenary contractors faced federal terrorism charges. The Russian oligarchs behind Meridian Development were sanctioned and expelled from the United States. Delilah Thornfield received 5 years probation and community service, with the condition that she testify against everyone involved in the conspiracy. The judge recognized that she'd been as much a victim as an accomplice. "Miss Thornfield," Judge Martinez said during sentencing, "your methods were deplorable, but your motives were tragically understandable. You will spend the next 5 years helping other families fight corporate land theft, using your experience to prevent future tragedies." The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks later, when sheriff's deputies delivered a federal court order requiring Delilah to personally remove every piece of equipment she'd installed in my pond: the ultrasonic torture devices, the hidden cameras. The control system, all of it had to be extracted by the woman who'd put it there. I watched from my porch as Delilah waded into the same water where she'd been arrested, now wearing chest-high waders and waterproof gloves. The news cameras were rolling again, but this time they captured justice, being served one device at a time. "I'm sorry," she called out as she pulled the last ultrasonic transmitter from beneath the lily pads. "I'm sorry for what I did to your horses. I'm sorry for terrorizing your family. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself." My horses watched the proceedings with what seemed like satisfaction. Thunder stood at the pond's edge, no longer afraid of the water that had been his source of comfort for 8 years. The younger horses followed his lead. Understanding that the threat was finally over, the federal government designated my property as a protected heritage site, ensuring that no future development could threaten the natural springs or the wildlife they supported. My horses became ambassadors for a new program, protecting family farms from corporate takeover attempts, but the most meaningful change was in Willowbrook Estates itself. The residents who documented the corporate invasion formed a new HOA board committed to transparency and community protection. They voted unanimously to dissolve all restrictions on agricultural operations and designated my ranch as a community asset that enhanced rather than threatened property values. "We learned something important that night," said Maria Santos, the new HOA president, during the community meeting where they formally apologized for Delilah's actions. "A neighborhood isn't about property values or aesthetic standards. It's about protecting each other when powerful forces try to harm our families." The restored pond reflected Colorado sunshine as my horses grazed peacefully around its edges. Thunder had sired 2 foals since the crisis ended, both healthy and unafraid of the water their father had once been forced to avoid. Standing on the same porch where I'd watched federal agents arrest a corporate army, I realized that some battles are bigger than property disputes or HOA harassment. They're about preserving the spaces where families can build legacies, where animals can live without fear, and where communities can resist the forces that try to reduce everything to profit margins. Delilah's torture devices had been designed to break my horses' spirits, but they'd accomplished the opposite. They'd revealed the strength of a community that refused to let outsiders destroy what generations had built. The pond still runs crystal clear, fed by springs that have never failed. My horses drink from water that tastes like freedom, and the only sounds that echo across our valley are the natural wind through grass, hoofbeats on earth, and the voices of neighbors who learned that sometimes protecting what you love requires standing together against forces you never saw coming. Justice, it turns out, sometimes requires getting your boots muddy, but when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, for family, legacies, and community values, and the right to live peacefully on your own land, muddy boots are a small price to pay for victory. The horses are safe, the water runs clear, and the neighborhood that once tried to destroy us now stands guard to protect what we built together. Sometimes, that's what America looks like when it works the way it was supposed to. 3 months after the corporate invasion of Willowbrook Estates, my story had inspired something I never expected: a national movement that transformed how America fights corporate land theft. The Willowbrook effect began when Senator Rebecca Martinez introduced the Rural Heritage Protection Act, federal legislation directly inspired by our battle against meridian development. The bill would create a national database of suspicious property acquisitions, require disclosure of all foreign investment in agricultural land, and establish rapid response teams to investigate corporate harassment of family farms. What happened in Colorado wasn't an isolated incident. Senator Martinez announced during her press conference on the Capitol steps, it was part of a systematic attack on American agricultural independence. The Riverstone family's courage exposed a threat to our national security, but the real impact was happening at the grassroots level, where families across America were discovering they weren't alone in their fights against corporate bullies. My phone rang constantly with calls from ranchers, farmers, and rural families who'd faced similar harassment campaigns. There was Maria Gonzalez in Texas, whose family's century-old cattle operation was being targeted by mysterious water quality violations. John Running Bear in Montana, whose tribal ranch faced constant code enforcement harassment from a recently formed HOA. Sarah Chen in Oregon, whose organic farm was being sabotaged by neighbors who'd moved from the city and complained about agricultural odors. Each story followed the same pattern Delilah had described during her confession: systematic harassment designed to force property sales, backed by developers with connections to offshore money. The Meridian investigation had exposed just one tentacle of an octopus that stretched across the entire country. Patricia Wyndham established the Rural Defense Legal Network, a nonprofit organization that connected threatened families with attorneys who understood corporate land theft tactics. Within 6 months, the network was handling over 200 cases in 37 states. The corporate raiders made one critical mistake. Patricia explained during her appearance on 60 Minutes. They assumed rural communities would fight these battles alone. But when you attack one family farm, you're attacking the heritage of every family that built their lives from the soil up. The program's first major victory came in Wyoming, where Patricia's team stopped a fake environmental emergency that would have forced the closure of 6 ranches. The tactics were identical to what we'd faced: forged documents, corrupted officials, and mercenaries disguised as environmental inspectors. But this time, the rural community was ready. Ranchers live-streamed every interaction with suspicious officials. County clerks were monitored by volunteer observers who verified document authenticity. Local law enforcement received training on corporate intimidation tactics. Most importantly, social media networks allowed real-time coordination between families facing similar threats. The attempted Wyoming land grab collapsed within 72 hours when federal agents arrested the entire fake inspection team. The companies behind the operation traced back to the same Russian oligarchs who'd funded Meridian development, proving that our victory in Colorado had only slowed their American expansion plans. Delilah Thornfield became an unlikely hero in this larger movement. Her community service assignment involved traveling to threatened properties and teaching families how to recognize the early warning signs of corporate harassment campaigns. I know exactly how these operations work, because I helped run one. She told a gathering of Nebraska farmers who were facing suspicious code enforcement actions. They start with small violations that seem reasonable, they escalate gradually to avoid triggering immediate resistance, and they always try to isolate you from your community. Her presentations were more effective than any law enforcement briefing because she spoke with the authority of someone who'd been inside the machine. Families trusted her warnings because she'd lived the consequences of corporate collaboration. I lost my family's farm because I believed the lawyers and bureaucrats who promised they were protecting us. She'd tell each audience, "Don't make my mistake. Trust your neighbors. Document everything. And never let them convince you that fighting back is hopeless." The most surprising development was Delilah's relationship with my horses. As part of her community service, she spent every weekend helping with ranch, maintenance, and animal care. The same animals she'd once terrorized with ultrasonic devices now approached her with curiosity rather than fear. Horses forgive easier than people. I observed one Saturday morning as she helped me repair fence posts. Maybe there's a lesson in that. Thunder, the stallion who'd charged her mercenary contractors, had become particularly attached to Delilah. He would follow her around the pasture like an oversized dog, apparently understanding that she was no longer a threat. "He's teaching me something I didn't learn in law school," Delilah said, scratching behind Thunder's ears. "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration." The media attention brought unexpected opportunities for the ranch. Netflix commissioned a documentary about corporate land theft that premiered at Sundance Film Festival. The Discovery Channel featured our horses in a series about wildlife conservation. Even Hollywood called. Though I turned down their offer to option our story for a feature film starring actors who'd never seen a real horse. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Society of Professional Journalists awarded our community the Press Freedom Award for citizen journalism that exposed threats to democratic institutions in an era of fake news and corporate propaganda. The Society's president announced, "The residents of Willowbrook Estates proved that ordinary Americans with smartphones can document truth more effectively than million-dollar newsrooms." Mrs. Chen, who'd recorded the mercenaries threatening children, gave the acceptance speech that brought the entire audience to their feet. "We didn't set out to be journalists," she said. "We just wanted to protect our neighbors. But we learned that in America, protecting your neighbors and protecting democracy are the same thing." The economic impact of our story surprised everyone. Property values in Willowbrook Estates increased by 30% as families moved to the community specifically because of how residents had responded to the corporate invasion. The development marketed itself as the neighborhood that fought back and won. Tourism followed the national attention. Families drove hundreds of miles to visit the ranch, where horses had fought corporate mercenaries. Thunder became a celebrity, posing for photos with children who'd seen his charge on viral video. The pond itself became a symbol that resonated far beyond our valley. Environmental groups used it as an example of how natural water sources could be protected from corporate exploitation. Native American activists pointed to our story as proof that sacred sites could be defended by coalitions of unlikely allies. "That spring has been flowing for thousands of years," said Elder Joseph Walking Bear during the ceremony, that officially designated our pond as a protected cultural site. "It will flow for thousands more because people learned to put community above profit." A year after Delilah's arrest, I received a letter that changed my understanding of everything we'd been through. It came from Victoria Blackstone, writing from federal prison where she was serving her life sentence. "Mr. Riverstone," the letter began, "you may be surprised to hear from the woman who tried to have you killed, but isolation gives you time to think about the choices that led to a prison cell." She explained that Meridian Development had targeted my ranch not just for the natural gas deposits, but because our successful horse rescue operation was inspiring other rural communities to resist corporate pressure. Our animals' recovery from trauma had become a metaphor for communities healing from economic devastation. "Your horses proved that broken things could be made whole again," she wrote. "That message threatened everything my employers represented. They sold despair, and you were selling hope." The letter revealed that our victory had saved dozens of other properties by exposing the corporate network before they could expand their operations. Families in 12 states were still living on ancestral land because our community had documented the truth. "I wanted you to know that your courage saved more than your ranch," Blackstone concluded. "It saved the idea that ordinary people can defeat extraordinary corruption from prison. That's a legacy worth envying." As I finished reading the letter on my porch, Thunder approached with his usual demand for attention. The scars from his encounter with mercenaries had faded, but his protective instincts remained sharp. He still positioned himself between my family and any strangers who visited the ranch. The pond reflected the evening sky like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the gentle movements of horses who no longer feared the water that sustained them. The ultrasonic torture devices were gone, replaced by the natural sounds of wildlife that had returned once the artificial threats were removed. Delilah arrived for her weekend volunteer work just as the sun was setting, carrying supplies for the new foal barn we were building, with donations from supporters around the world. The same woman who'd once terrorized my animals was now helping expand their sanctuary. "Thank you," she said quietly, as she often did when we worked together in comfortable silence. "For what? For proving that redemption is possible. For you? For me? For everyone who gets a second chance to do the right thing." My horses drink from clear water, graze on protected land, and raise their young without fear, because a community learned that some things are worth defending. That's a legacy worth passing to the next generation, written in the language of flowing springs and galloping hooves that corporate boardrooms will never understand. The pond still runs crystal clear, and the horses are finally home.